Emotional hunger, however, is more located in our minds. And we think something looks good or sounds good or something of that nature. And we want to eat it to feel differently, to feel better, to comfort ourselves, to soothe ourselves.
What if there are things we never had the opportunity to learn? We've all been to school or training, but there are things they never taught us that actually make a powerful difference in life. I'm here to share with you all the pieces you've been missing: mindset, health, success, and more. And we'll all learn together from guests along the way. We may not have learned it the traditional way, but oh my goodness, let's keep learning how to do things differently. OMG, my friends. I am so excited about this episode because we have a great guest with us today. And you have heard me talk a little bit about my journey with eating and food issues back in episode 8 when I was talking about the 2 types of food that everyone needs. And our emotional relationship with food is such a powerful issue that I wanted to dive into it further. So you may or may not feel like you have chronic issues with food or emotions, but I think we all have some emotional ties and maybe memories that are related to food that can sometimes be a challenge. So that is why we have Dr. Nina Savelle-Rocklin. She is a psychoanalyst, author, and radio host, and she is a globally recognized expert in the field of eating disorders. So she has written 4 books and more than 50 articles and has been featured in quite a number of publications you would have heard of, like Good Housekeeping, the Los Angeles Times, Prevention, Real Simple, Redbook, Huffington Post, and many others. She hosts the Dr. Nina Show, Outsmart Emotional Eating on LA Talk Radio, and The Binge Cure with Dr. Nina on Voice America. She founded the Binge Cure method and is really dedicated to helping people worldwide overcome binge eating and heal their relationship with food. So, welcome. Thank you for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This is such an important topic. I'm really happy that we're going to be able to dig into it a little bit. So, I always like to start with kind of finding out people's stories. And so, tell us a little bit about how you ended up focusing on binge eating and doing what you do now.
When I was a brand new therapist, I got a similar question, but it was phrased a little bit differently. I walked into my first group meeting with my first group for women struggling with binge eating, and one of them looked at me and said, "So what does a skinny bitch like you know about binge eating?"
Oh.
Yeah, that was my that was my reaction too. Oh my God. And what she didn't know was I once considered myself the poster child for eating disorders. But what I said was, this skinny bitch once scarfed down an entire box of gingerbread cookies in about 15 minutes flat. And I hate gingerbread, but I couldn't stop eating those cookies. And I told the group that when I was 5 years old, I came to believe that somehow I was too big. Specifically, I should have skinnier legs. I don't know why. And I was a perfectly normal weight child, but I had this notion that I should be smaller, I should be skinnier. And this ended up becoming the start of my descent into really eating disorder hell, so that by the time I was an adolescent, my mind was completely occupied with food and weight. And every journal of that time in my teenage years, they were numbers: calories I ate, calories I burned, the weight I was, the weight I was going to be one day. And I was always on some crazy restrictive diet. Eventually, my willpower would fail and I would eat the kitchen. And sometimes I would purge, which is why I considered myself the poster child for eating disorders. I had all of them. And I finally went to therapy in college, but I went for anxiety. And I talked about guys and goals and dreams and fears and family and all the things, but I never talked about food. My therapist had no idea that I was struggling, that she was in fact treating the poster child for eating disorders. And I was too mortified, actually. Why did I never talk about it? I was too embarrassed. I was just too ashamed. So nobody knew the truth. And yet by the time I left treatment, all my eating disorders were gone for good. And not once, not a single time, had I ever talked about food, eating disorders, anything of the like with my therapist. And people say, well, how is that possible? How do you overcome all eating disorders without ever talking about food?
Right.
And the answer is that food was never the problem. It was the solution to the problem, which was my toxic relationship with myself. I was a perfectionist. Nothing I did was ever good enough. And I would basically binge to get away from my own mean voice, essentially. And as I turned my critic into a friend and learned new ways of relating to myself and responding to myself, everything with food changed. And also, why at age 5 did I suddenly decide that my legs were too big?
Mm-hmm.
So my parents are both college professors, very academic, very scholarly, and I was a kid and I was constantly being told, and I was not like a quiet scholarly kid. I so I was constantly being told, like, you're too loud, you're too emotional, you're too sensitive, you're too much was essentially the message that I was being given. And my 5-year-old mind was very concrete. 5-year-olds are very concrete. So I took the you're too much message and turned it into, well, there must be too much of me,
Oh my.
literally. And so my experience as a 5-year-old and my experience in therapy both speak to the importance of understanding the psychology of binge eating disorder and eating disorders in general, which are not about food,
Right. Right.
and recognizing the roots to them. And that led me to become a therapist and then eventually a psychoanalyst specializing in binge eating.
And it's so powerful when we end up in a career that has personal meaning to us. I think that makes all the difference for sure. And I could tell as you're talking about that. And I think I mentioned this to you briefly, but not very much. I had issues with binge eating as well when I was in grad school. And it's a similar story because I did go to counseling for that, but we didn't talk about food or eating. Really, we talked about emotions. And I did not know how to express them, and I didn't know what I was feeling, and I had to work on that. So it's really a similar story.
Absolutely. I don't talk about food with my patients or clients in my coaching programs at all. I mean, only to understand what the underlying needs or emotions might be that are driving their behavior. I like the analogy of a weed and a root. If you just go on a diet or you just talk about food or you just have willpower control and say, I will not eat that, it's like plucking a weed and hoping it will not grow back. You
Mm,
don't have to be a gardener to know it will indeed grow back. So why I like this analogy is that the root is hidden from us. We can't see it. It is in the earth, it is in the ground. We can't see it, and yet it causes the weed, it creates the weed. And similarly, we have unconscious or hidden from us ideas, thoughts, conflicts that are out of our awareness. They're hidden from us. We're in the dark about them,
yeah.
and yet they have everything to do with our behavior. And that's why I consider myself like a detective of the mind. Like, okay, I'm going to solve the mystery of why you're doing the thing you don't want to do or why you're not doing the thing you want to do, instead of focus on all the practical, logical reasons. It's not logical, it's psychological.
Right. So true. And actually, it's funny that you went down this path because what I was about to ask you is it feels like emotions and food are linked in this weird, hidden, sneaky way. And how does that happen or where does that come from?
Well, our very first experience of being fed is of being held. By the way, I once had someone say to me, she said, why can't I be addicted to meth? At least I'd be skinny. And
Gosh.
I know, and she was serious. She was absolutely, completely serious, which is so tragic. But what I told her is that our very first experience of being held as babies, as infants, we're in someone's arms, we feel held, there's usually a gaze upon us, we feel this blissful state of connection with another person, and that experience is bound up with being fed. So in our psyche, food equals relationship. We don't think of it consciously that way, but if we look at our vernacular in our society, we talk about being hungry for love, starving for attention. We talk about fulfilling, satisfying relationships. And so it's covert, but the message is that comfort food, right? Comfort food, we talk about
Yes.
comfort food. It's really a wish to be comforted by someone else. And so it really relates to our speech, our language, all of these expressions indicate that connection between yearning and connection with another person and food. But people can be unpredictable, unreliable, and unavailable. Food is predictable, it is available, it is reliable. And so often we end up turning to food instead of to people as a way of comforting ourselves, soothing ourselves. And if we do reach out to people, often they don't know how to help us because we live in a society that says, ooh, don't have emotions. So they do their best. They'll tell us things like, it's not that bad. It could be worse. Look on the bright side. At least it wasn't whatever, you know. And
Yeah.
this kind of toxic positivity is so dismissive. We live in a society that doesn't teach us how to express, identify, much less express, identify our emotions and express them and respond to ourselves. And so much of the problems that we have in our society, people don't know how to cope. They don't know what they're feeling. They don't know how to deal with what they're feeling, and they don't know how to respond to themselves. And that's why so many people use things like food or shopping or so many different strategies that they're coping strategies to cope with emotions. When we can learn how to cope differently, everything changes.
Yes. Yes. It's so interesting. I fully agree that we are, well, I'm generalizing obviously, but most of us are not really that great at identifying and then expressing our emotions because in the mindset coaching that I do, I'll ask people, well, how did that make you feel? And they'll give me a big explanation. And what I'm trying to get them to say is frustrated or sad or, an actual feeling word. And that's really hard for us sometimes to identify. It's really interesting.
Yes, because our culture pathologizes our natural human emotions and makes them into character flaws. Or there's something wrong. Like if you're depressed, oh, you're sad, you must be depressed. Or even if you're depressed, you must need a pill. Now, some people absolutely can benefit from medication, but I'm talking about the natural normal reactions to situations, whether you're sad or angry. You don't need anger management classes because you get mad.
Right.
It is a reaction to a feeling, and you are not an angry person. You are a person who is angry, and the same with anxiety, and the same with all feelings. But we are taught that there's somehow something very bad about this, so don't feel them.
Yeah.
And yet, especially for women, women are socialized not to feel anger. That's not nice. And so we often, I call it the boomerang effect. We get mad at ourselves
Mm,
for eating or what we weigh. So it's, oh, I'm so mad at my spouse or my boss or my kids, but I understand why they did that. You know what? I'm actually mad at myself because I ate bagels. I'm so mad at myself. So
mm,
they displace so much of this anger that is disavowed onto themselves. And men are socialized not to feel vulnerable, and they often convert everything to anger and don't know how to access or express the vulnerable, tender feelings or more passive feelings that
right.
we all experience.
Right. That's an interesting point because on this podcast, we tend to be talking to women and talking about women, but we both sides of this issue, we have our things, right? That ways that we've been affected by society or by our past. Yeah.
Absolutely. And learning to not just identify it, but to then express it. And what I hear a lot is, oh, I guess I just need to sit through my feelings. And I'm like, you can't sit through your feelings until they're gone any more than you can drop them, ignore them, positive think them away, or stuff them down. And you have to be able to express them.
Yeah.
And no one knows what that means, which is why I encourage people to think about, like, what would you say to a child who was upset, like a baby? You don't just say a baby falls down. You say, you say, "Oh, you fell down. That's okay. You can get up. I know you hurt yourself." We acknowledge it. Like, yeah, that really hurts.
You're right.
Yeah, that does. Once I did absolutely the wrong thing with my daughter, and this will pertain to feelings of what this is a what not to do that leads into what to do. So when my daughter was like 6 or 7, she fell down and she scraped her knee and she started crying and she said, "Oh my God, it hurts so much." And I did everything wrong. I said, "That's not that bad. It could have
Mm.
been worse." I'm sure I said all of these things. And naturally, she keeps crying, crying and crying and crying. And I finally realized, oh my gosh, I'm doing the thing that I tell everyone not to do. I'm doing it. So I immediately pivoted and said, "Actually, that looks painful. Ooh, that must hurt a lot." And she stopped crying and she's like, "Yeah, yeah, it does." And
Oh,
we miss the acknowledging part. We miss validating and acknowledging our feelings. We go straight to reassuring or minimizing or distracting. And we really need to learn to say, yes, this is painful. This is upsetting. Now, how does this pertain to emotional wounds? It's the same thing. If
right.
you're if you're sad and someone tells you all the reasons why you shouldn't be sad, you're not going to say, "Oh, you're right. I shouldn't be sad." You're just going to feel frustrated and not understood. But if someone says, "Yes, I can understand why you're sad. That is a sad, terrible situation," you're going to feel heard. And we have to do that to ourselves as well. Really hear ourselves.
This is such a good point, and it's making me think, in my family, we lost someone recently, and it was expected, and he lived a long life, but it's sad, of course, and he left a widow behind, and I was reading a little bit about what do you say to someone when they've lost their spouse, and basically what I was reading is exactly what you're saying. Just say, "This sucks. I'm sorry." Like
Absolutely.
not trying to gloss it over, just letting them be acknowledged. So, yeah.
Yeah, I had a friend who had a miscarriage, and everyone said, "Oh, you'll get pregnant again. Oh, all these things like it'll be okay. You'll have a kid. It'll happen." And her mother-in-law said, "This is just terrible. I This is just the worst. This is awful. This is so painful." And that was the only thing that helped her.
Right.
And so when we can recognize what we're feeling, express it, validate, acknowledge it, express it, then we don't need to stuff it or distract
Right.
ourselves.
Right. And for me, I had a very bad temper when I was a kid, and I'm sure I still have it. I just know how to control it. But my mom used to teach me to hit the pillows on my bed. When I would get upset, I would like punch those pillows, and I wasn't hurting anything, but I needed to get it out. But then when I got older, as an adult, you don't go around hitting the pillows. And I maybe that was part of the issue that I had to figure out is how do I express this because I don't know how anymore.
And when we don't express something, let's just use anger as an example. When we don't express something, everything feels so intense and like a 10 out of 10. But anger, like frustration is a form of anger. Irritation, annoyance, rage, these are all forms of anger. And we not only need to identify what emotion we're feeling, but the intensity of it. And if we don't, then annoyance can feel like rage. Irritation
Mhm.
can feel like rage. Everything can feel like too much. And then sometimes we also turn to food to sedate ourselves.
Yes.
So if you're full of feelings and you don't have a way of expressing them, food acts as a sedative, especially super carby foods. Just sedate.
Yes. Good point. And I imagine alcohol sort of comes into that to a certain extent as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Part of healthy living is gut health. So much of our hormones, digestion, and nutrition centers around a healthy gut. Every morning, I use a green gut glow drink to make sure that my brain, skin, nails, hair, and gut are at their best, and to make sure that I get more veggies than I would eat otherwise. I felt a difference for sure. Grab yours or have a look at www.bit.ly/green gut glow plus, or just find it in the show notes. Wow. Okay. Well, I've already learned a lot. And I'm sure our listeners have. So help us figure out what some signs are that we might notice in our behaviors and in our life, even if maybe we're not dealing with a binge disorder or an eating disorder per se. What are some signs we might notice that food is kind of becoming a crutch for our emotions, or that we have that unhealthy relationship with it?
Well, it's a great question, and this is worthy of your attention. If you have any kind of an unhealthy, unhappy relationship with food, you don't have to have fully clinically diagnosable binge eating disorder to struggle and to suffer. So one thing is to really differentiate between physical and emotional hunger. Physical hunger is physical. We feel it in our bodies, and we get, a gurgling stomach, or I get lightheaded and lose my words. My family always knows when I'm hungry because I'm just like, I can't finish the sentence. So we feel it in our bodies, and when we're physically hungry, we're not so picky. We're just really hungry. We're going to have something to eat because we need to assuage our hunger. Emotional hunger, however, is more located in our minds, and we think something looks good or sounds good or something of that nature, and we want to eat it to feel differently, to feel better, to comfort ourselves, to soothe ourselves, to distract ourselves. And if we really want to go go to more depth, and as a psychoanalyst, which is, I'm a depth psychologist, so we go deeper, we go home.
Right.
So to fill a void, to symbolically fill a void, or express anger with crunch, and or convert emotional pain into physical pain. For people who they've told me so many times, I ate so much my stomach hurt, but I couldn't stop. Yeah, you were converting your emotional pain to physical pain. Physical pain is easier to get rid of. And no one's consciously, rubbing their hands together. Okay, I will now convert my emotional pain to physical pain. These are the hidden roots. So that's something to think about. Are you physically hungry, or are you emotionally hungry? Are you eating something to change the way you emotionally feel? And
Mm,
that's very important to look at. And also pay attention to the difference between overeating and binge eating. A lot of people say, oh my God, I binged, I ate 4 cookies.
right, right.
Someone else will say, I ate 40 cookies. Yeah, that's a binge. So binging is eating a lot of food in a very quick period of time, usually, and being filled with self-recrimination and self-hatred and shame and guilt and all of those things. And people generally know when they are binge eating. But maybe, are you eating 4 cookies because you were hungry and that's all you had? That's different from, I'm eating those 4 cookies because either deprivation, I can't have it, so once I have it, I might as well have a lot of it, or, oh, I'm going to have those cookies because they're going to make me feel better. I once had a patient whose mother would always, whenever she was sad, her mother would not say, "Of course you're sad. That is a sad situation." You know, her
Right.
mother would say, "Let's get ice cream. You can't be sad if you're eating ice cream."
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting because I caught myself when my kids were growing up sometimes using ice cream or something like that as a reward as well. And then I had to pull back and have a variety because I don't think that's good either, right?
Yes, my kids, I would say, do you want some hummus and carrots, or do you want some ice cream? I would offer them two choices, and one would be considered healthy and one not so much. And because they were just offered these choices as two just equal choices, they could retain their ability to eat intuitively. Do you want some
Mm,
crackers and cheese, or do you want some cookies? And often they would choose, sometimes they would choose the cookies, sometimes they would choose the ice cream, but more often they would choose the healthier foods, because I wasn't creating deprivation or reward with those special foods, you know. I mean,
right.
dentists give kids candy. My, my the pediatric dentist gives kids candy as a reward.
I know it's
What is
very prevalent.
Are you trying to drum up more business, or are you just sending the wrong message, or both? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's real. So those are starting with that, recognizing, what is the motivation, and realizing that it may seem that you are triggered by food, but you are not triggered by food. You're triggered by something going on within you that you may or may not be aware of, that's making you turn to food to cope.
Right. And maybe then trying to figure out, okay, how am I actually feeling? Can I identify it?
How am I feeling? What am I feeling? And sometimes that's hard to do. I had someone who told me, "Hey, Dr. Nina, maybe your other patients are struggling with emotional eating." She said she's a food addict and she could prove it, knowing that I don't believe in food addiction. Okay, I'm all ears. Please present your proof. And she told me that the night before she had been just Netflix and chilling. She'd been watching her favorite show. And all of a sudden, as she put it, Ben and Jerry's was calling her name. She said, "Calling my name. I'm addicted to Chunky Monkey." I said, "What were you watching on TV?" "Oh, it was my favorite show, Charmed." See, she was doing something she enjoyed. There was no reason she thought that she would want to down a pint of ice cream. What was the episode about? Oh, it's when the demon breaks the bond between the sisters and they start fighting and it gets all contentious and crazy. And then she looked at me and I looked at her and I went, "Oh, sisters fighting, right?" And she's like, "Oh my God, I see what happened." Because she, of course, had a terrible relationship with her sister. Watching the show activated her sister conflict. But before it was in her conscious awareness, she went to ice cream for comfort and distraction. And that's why it can be tricky. And that's why I created the food mood formula that I have in my book and now in my new binge cure journal, to help people identify those hidden reasons why. Because often, it feels like it's ice cream, but no, something else is motivating your wish to have ice cream. That is the solution to the problem. It is not the problem. Sometimes it's just tricky finding out what the problem is.
Right. Such a good point. And these things happen quickly, right? You're saying she didn't really take any time to think that through. She just went. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Because our minds protect ourselves. Our protection also hurts us. That's why I call binge eating a frenemy. It is a friend. It does something for you. It is protecting you from something, or it's offering comfort or soothing or what have you. But of course, it is an enemy, more of an enemy than a friend, because it hurts you. It hurts your self-esteem. It hurts your body, and it doesn't let you cope with the things that you need to be able to learn to cope with.
Right. And that's addressing that is, I suppose, the next key piece of this is, okay, if we recognize some of these issues, we can definitely start asking ourselves if we're hungry. That's a great tip because I think we can maybe start to practice recognizing that. But then if we start to realize, okay, I do have some things here where I'm eating emotionally. I see that I'm not hungry. Then what are some practical things that people can do?
Well, first, think, don't reflect, and which is really the step that you just said. Wait, what's motivating this? And even if you can't figure out what's going on, ice cream, it's comfort, it's distraction. What am I distracting myself from? What am I not thinking about or feeling because I'm going to eat, or I'm thinking about food? Because often with binge eating disorder, by the way, binge eating disorder is the most prevalent eating disorder there is, way more prevalent than anorexia and bulimia combined. And most people don't even realize they have a treatable, diagnosable eating disorder. But to be able to say, okay, if I were not thinking about food, I was going to say that the obsession and the preoccupation is also a part of it. It's not just the
Yes.
eating part, it's the constantly thinking about it and perseverating about it and all of that. So it's to say, what would I be thinking about if I were not worried about food? If I were not thinking about my weight or food or any of that, what would be on my mind? What would I be worried about? What is this distracting me from? And another practical thing that I recommend is when you feel that urge to binge, I call it go surfing, right? Just as a wave, emotional surfing, just as a wave builds in intensity, it builds, it builds, it builds, it builds, and finally it crests and then it crashes to the surf. So does that urge to binge. So if you can just kind of surf the feeling for a while and know It's not going to feel so intense. And then so you identify what's going on, and then you express it without turning against yourself.
Right.
I feel this way because it means this. This happened and it means this. And I feel this because of this. And then uh, I have an acronym I call vary your response as a way of comforting yourself, and it's validate, acknowledge, and reassure yourself. And then when you realize, oh, I'm feeling like so upset, you, instead of, here's all the reasons why I shouldn't feel it, of course I feel this way. How could I not? This is an upsetting situation. And then you give yourself the reassurance. And
Mm,
practicing these steps, at first it's like you sit down and try to play the piano. You don't play Tchaikovsky right away. You can barely eke out Mary Had a Little Lamb. You have
right.
to learn how to, what keys go to what fingers, and it's awkward and it feels weird and it's not natural. Same with any change, same with this, but eventually it becomes second nature, and then you're naturally being there for yourself, reassuring yourself, comforting and soothing yourself. You stop turning to food for that purpose.
Right. And that's a good point. It takes time and we have to kind of practice and learn, because someone who, speaking from personal experience, is in the middle of something like this is not easy stuff that you're talking about, to recognize these things.
It is not easy, but why I call my method the binge cure method. And someone wrote a review and said this book is not titled correctly because there's no cure for eating disorders. They had no idea what they were talking about. They're not even, there is a cure. There is a cure. I don't believe in recovery. Recovery means, always waking up every day and thinking about being good and mindful and all of that. The cure is liberation, which means you just wake up and think about your day, not your diet. It is hard to do this work, but it is liberating. It is easier to focus on what you are eating than what's eating at you. But once you can bravely look within, understand yourself better, learn new ways of responding to yourself, then everything changes for good. You're liberated, you're cured, it's done, and it's worth it.
Agreed, agreed, agreed. Fully agreed. Yes. And what an optimistic mic drop moment there. So tell us, how can people connect with you? And if someone is kind of recognizing some things in themselves as they're hearing this, what do you propose as the best thing for them to look at or go to?
Well, they can reach me at my website, Dr. Nina Inc., DrNinaInc, drninainc.com, where they can find links to my Facebook community if you want to join a group of people who get it and are doing the same, like on the same journey, doing that deep dive. And you can find my books, find my radio shows. You can find me on Instagram, on TikTok. I'm everywhere. And I would, of course, recommend that they get my book, The Binge Cure. I wrote The Binge Cure because I had written scholarly books, and I was doing my radio show, and people would constantly say, "Well, where can I read about this stuff that you're talking about? How can I what books do you recommend?" And I realized I needed to write the book that no one had written
That they're
and
looking for. Yeah.
they're looking for. So that's The Binge Cure,
Perfect.
7 Steps to Outsmart Emotional Eating. And I just recently, within the last 2 weeks, released the companion. It's a workbook, the Binge Cure Journal. So here's that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
And it's a guide to liberating yourself from emotional eating, taking control of your life, and feeling good in your body. So I would recommend that you start there. Join my group, get my book, connect with me. I answer everything, every email I get, I answer myself. I have a team of people, but I believe that it's really important for people to hear directly from me. So if you have a question, please feel free to reach out. I will get back to you.
I'm glad you said that, because I think a lot of times people do have questions and we're nervous to ask, or we think we're going to be pawned off onto some sort of bot or something like that. So that's important.
Yeah. No bots here.
Perfect. And I will put that the link to your book in our book list, which is on my podcast website as well. And all of that will be in the show notes. So definitely connect with Nina if any of this is resonating with you for sure. All right. So now time as we kind of wrap up for the question I ask everyone. And that is, if you are trying to get yourself into a better mood, pep yourself up, maybe get over a bad day, what is your favorite song to listen to?
Well, I happen to adore this artist called Tender Misfit. She's kind of a punk pop star. And anything that she writes, and she writes most of her music is written by her and performed by her. She is my daughter.
I love it. I thought maybe there was a personal connection.
Yes, she's my older daughter, and she's out. I just saw her last night in LA. She plays out like 2 or 3 times a week. She's amazing, and her music just makes me happy. And if it didn't make me happy, it's not nepotism. I am slightly biased, but not that biased. And then, my other aunt, so anything by Tender Misfit, look her up. She's amazing. And then can I answer 2? Because I have another one.
I'll give you 2.
So in my 20s, I discovered Frank Sinatra. I'm like some kind of old soul person. But in my 20s, I was not listening to rap like all my friends. I was listening to Frank Sinatra. And My Way I love that song. So I would have to say that you can't get 2 more disparate artists than Tender Misfit and Frank Sinatra, but there you have it.
You know what? That's why this playlist has been so much fun, because no one has ever said either of those things. We've only ever had one repeat, and it is such a mix of different types of songs and genres and everything, but it has just become this like powerful, uplifting thing. So I love those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, this was a personal issue for me because I have gone through what Nina was talking about today. And so I really appreciate you taking this time. And if there are people who are listening, you know what, even if it's not binging, as we were saying, there's a lot of emotional stuff that we deal with food. And I hope that this helps you listeners to maybe identify, and you got a couple practical steps too that I'll restate in the show notes as well to help you kind of work through it and feel your feelings, which I guess is really a lot of what it comes down to, right?
Absolutely. It sounds scarier than it is. Well, once you get the hang of it, it's incredibly freeing, and it's not as scary as we think. And by the way, I treat people who have struggled for decades, 30, 40, even 50 years. And I want you to know, if that's you, there's always hope. You learned this way of relating to yourself, and you can learn a different way. There is hope for you.
Oh gosh, what a great way to wrap this up. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. OMG, I would be so honored if you would take a moment, leave a rating, leave a review, or take a screenshot and share on your social media. Let's get this message out further into the world. Now it's time to head down to the show notes to see the resources I mentioned. We may not have learned this before, but it sure is powerful now.